Mr. Secretary, on behalf of Al Jazeera Network, we're absolutely delighted to be here in the Pentagon doing this interview with you. Thank you for your time. There are obviously, as you know, rumblings of discontent among Americans about what's going on in Afghanistan. How much is that of a concern to you personally as the Secretary of Defense?
Americans know that our country has been at war for a number of years, ever since we were attacked in 2001. And obviously we've lost a lot of our young men and women. And so there is a certain war weariness on the part of the American people. But by the same token, I believe that they and members of our Congress vividly remember that it was from Afghanistan that the attack on us was launched, and that the Taliban did not just provide a safe haven for al-Qaeda, but actively cooperated with them. And so I think the American people know that we have to work with the Afghan government and the Afghan people so that they can establish control over their own territory. I mean, the reality is also that al-Qaeda has killed many more Muslims than it has Americans and Europeans and others. And so this is a challenge we all face, and I'm confident that the American people will sustain their commitment to help the Afghan people.
There are Americans on both the left and the right, and there are people outside the United States who look at what's going on in Afghanistan, and they conclude that the United States is in a bit of a pickle in Afghanistan. How much of a pickle do you think the United States is in?
I think the picture is mixed. It's clear that the Taliban have had success in re-infiltrating back into the country. They have intimidated a lot of Afghans. And so we and our allies and the Afghan security forces clearly have our work cut out for us. The situation is serious, but we can be successful.
Now, recently there's been the incident in Qunduz where 90 people were killed, and there are reports that the 90 people included civilians. That has been a constant theme in Afghanistan, the killing of civilians. How much of a real problem is that in terms of the strategy that President Obama would like to see implemented there?
I think it's a real problem, and General McChrystal believes it's a real problem. Clearly, we regret any loss of innocent life in Afghanistan. And one of the central themes of General McChrystal's new approach in Afghanistan is significant change in our tactical approach to try and minimize the number of innocent civilians who are killed. So he has changed the rules in terms of the use of air power. He has issued a tactical directive that our convoys obey Afghan traffic laws, and in fact that our troops take some additional risk to avoid innocent Afghan casualties. Part of the challenge here is that the Taliban actively target innocent civilians, and they make it very difficult. Central to the success of the 42 nations that are trying to help the Afghan people is that the Afghan people continue to believe that we are their friends, we are their partners, and we are there to help them. And so civilian casualties are a problem for us, and we are doing everything conceivable to try and avoid them.
Now, there has been increasing support among the Afghans for the Taliban, and that has enabled the Taliban to make a lot of the gains that we hear about, military gains. Now you're saying that the Afghan people continue to support the United States?
Based on the latest polling that we have nationwide in Afghanistan, fewer than 10% of the people support the Taliban. The Taliban's approach is one principally of intimidation of villagers and others. And the Afghans don't want to live under those circumstances. They don't want to live under the Taliban rule again. And while they may not actively support the United States, neither do they support the Taliban. The Afghan people have been at war for over 30 years, and what they want is peace and security. And over time, we are in a position to try and bring that to them.
Given all the things that you say the United States is doing to explain to the Afghans that the United States military is there to help them, do you think that holds water in the eyes of the majority of Afghans, knowing the historical rejection of foreign powers in their country?
I think that the historical rejection of foreign powers has been because the Afghan people have come to see those powers, whether it's Britain or the Soviet Union or anyone else, as being there for their own imperial interests rather than being there in the interests of the Afghan people. We have no interest in a permanent presence in Afghanistan. We have no interest in bases in Afghanistan. What our principal interest is in giving Afghanistan the capacity to protect its own people and to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a center of violent extremists again. And then we'll leave. And I think that's an important message from us to the Afghan people.
So you think the war in Afghanistan is winnable, given that Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said it's achievable?
I don't like to speak in terms of winning or losing. I think we need to speak in terms of achieving our objectives. I don't believe that President Obama would have made the commitment he has made if he did not believe that we could achieve our objectives in Afghanistan.
Some people are saying, well, to secure the gains that the United States makes in Afghanistan, the troops level needs to be increased. But others say, well, the more you increase the level of US troops in Afghanistan, the more targets the Taliban have in terms of their tactics to drive the United States out of Afghanistan.
Well, there are arguments obviously on both sides of this issue. I've had a number of reservations about significant additional U.S. troops. One of those is whether our forces come to be seen by the Afghans at some point as occupiers rather than as partners. General McChrystal's point is it's really how those forces are used and how they interact with the Afghan people that determines how they are seen by the Afghans. And I think that the approach that he has taken mitigates the concern that I had. And frankly, I haven't made up my own mind at this point in terms of whether I think more forces are needed.
As far as you're concerned, what basically saying is that any thinking of withdrawing the U.S. military from Afghanistan, even thinking about it, at this particular point in time is absolutely out of the question.
That's my view.
I would like to get you to talk a little bit about Pakistan. George Will, as you know, wrote about Pakistan saying that it is the country that really matters. What do you make of that? And given that the implications are that Afghanistan does not really matter and the U.S. should get out of Afghanistan.
Pakistan clearly is important. It is important in its own right to the United States as a friend and ally, but it is also important in terms of violent extremists that cross back and forth across that border and put both the government of Afghanistan and the government of Pakistan at risk.
Now, given the serious misgivings that the United States had in the past, there were accusations to Pakistani intelligence at that time that they were actually lending a hand of support to the Taliban. Are you 100% satisfied now that that has stopped and that you, the Pakistani military, and the Pakistani civilian government are all in the same trench, working for the same goal?
The Pakistanis are very concerned about the stability of that border area and about the stability of Afghanistan. and they weren't sure whether we would continue our efforts in Afghanistan. So I believe we are on the same page. I believe we're working for the same goals. I have a lot of confidence in the Pakistanis.
The implication of what you're saying is that the United States will not do again what it did after the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, which is to cut loose and leaving the regional players to fend for themselves, undermining the credibility of the United States in that part of Asia.
I think that's absolutely right. And I have to say, I was in the American government at the time we did that, and it was a serious strategic mistake. As soon as the Soviets left Afghanistan, we turned our backs on Afghanistan. And we did not cultivate our relationship with the Pakistanis properly. And so I think we gave rise to doubts in the region about whether we are prepared to stay there and be their partner on a continuing basis. And I believe we have learned our lesson, and that both Afghanistan and Pakistan can count on us for the long term.
And in terms of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, you are absolutely categorically sure that there is no risk that they may fall into the wrong hands?
I'm quite comfortable that the security arrangements for the Pakistani nuclear capabilities are sufficient and adequate.
Were you baffled by President Obama's envoy, Richard Holbrooke, when he was asked about progress and how he would measure progress, and he said, "We'll know it when we see it"?
I probably would have answered the question differently.
How would you have answered it?
I would have answered it when we see the Afghan national security forces, the army and the police, assuming a greater and greater role in protecting the Afghan people, so that we can recede first into an advisory role and then leave altogether. So in a way, it's somewhat comparable to the situation in Iraq.
Well, I'm glad you've given me a very smooth transition into Iraq. So I'd like to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about Iraq and Iran and possibly other topics later in the show. Mr. Gates, welcome yet again to the show. How satisfied that the Iraqi central government, led by Nouri Maliki at the present time, can hold the country together after you leave?
I think we have real confidence that they can do that. And I think the best evidence that this sense of Iraqi nationalism has returned is that al-Qaeda has made very strong efforts in recent weeks and months to try and provoke a renewal of the sectarian violence between the Sunni and the Shia through suicide bombers. And what has been interesting and encouraging is that they have failed in that effort. The Shia understand this is al-Qaeda trying to provoke that kind of a conflict, and they're having none of it, and so there has not been a renewal of the sectarian violence.
A lot of people in the region will look at 2003 and what the United States did post-2003 in Iraq, and they'll say, well, actually, that was the engine of sectarian strife in Iraq in the first place.
Well, I wasn't in government at the time, and I am no expert on Iraq. Before I came into government, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert now either. But
would you say that U.S. getting out of Iraq would necessarily put an end to sectarian strife, or would it actually increase the prospects of sectarian strife there?
I think that what we have already seen in Iraq, despite the provocations by al-Qaeda, that Iraqis are ready to move beyond the violence of the last several years and to grow their economy and to have peace. I think that's why you have not seen a renewed sectarian violence, and that's why we are comfortable with the arrangements in which we have withdrawn from the cities and which we will withdraw all of our combat troops by the end of August next year.
And after you leave, my understanding is that President Obama pledged that the United States will not build any permanent military bases in Iraq. Does that pledge still stand?
Absolutely. All U.S. forces will be out of Iraq by the end of 2011. That is the agreement that we have with the Iraqi government. All U.S. forces. No bases, no forces.
Unless the Iraqis ask you to stay longer.
Unless there is some new agreement or some new negotiation, which would clearly be on Iraqi terms. But we will not have any permanent bases in Iraq. We have no interest in permanent bases in Iraq.
A lot of people, including some of your closest allies in the Gulf, think that the real winner after the invasion of 2003 is Iran. And you have a big problem with Iran.
Well, I think Iran has been a challenge for the United States and for the international community, for that matter, for 30 years. I think that a strong and democratic Iraq becomes a barrier to Iranian influence, not a bridge for it. And so I think in the short term, perhaps Iran's position was strengthened somewhat. But I think if you look to the longer term and the role that Iraq can play in the region going forward, I think that Iran's position may well be diminished.
But a lot of people feel that you took out one fundamental bastion against Iranian influence in the region, and that is the regime of Saddam Hussein. You changed the political configuration in the country, bringing a Shia government to power. Everybody knows that there are Iraqi politicians in the Iraqi government who were very close to Iran. How is that going to be a bastion against Iranian influence even in the long term?
Well, I think first of all we've seen over the past year or so a genuine assertion of Iraqi nationalism. If the United States has learned anything, it is that the Iraqis are very sensitive about their sovereignty and as with almost any other country, are not going to tolerate other countries trying to interfere in their internal affairs.
Hasn't Iran being able to increase its influence in neighboring Iraq strengthened its hand in dealing with the West over its nuclear program?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that that the situation in Iraq has little bearing on Iran and its nuclear program.
Can you guarantee that the Iranians will not use Iraq to retaliate against the United States, for example?
Well, I'm not going to address hypothetical situations. I mean, our view is that there is still an opportunity for diplomacy and political and economic pressures to bring about a change of policy in Iran. So getting into hypotheticals about military action, I think, doesn't take us very far.
Okay, I'll move away from the hypothetical. You're asking the Iranians to give up their intentions to build nuclear weapons. They are saying they're not trying to build nuclear weapons. On the other hand, a lot of people in the region feel that you know that the Israelis do have nuclear weapons. And they say, why doesn't the West start with Israel, who is known for sure to hold and to possess nuclear weapons, rather than with the Iranians who are suspected of having these nuclear weapons? What do you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, it's the Iranian leadership that has said that they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Those threats have not been made in the other direction. It is the Iranian government that is in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions with respect to these programs. And so the focus needs to be on the country that is thwarting the will of the international community and the United Nations.
But you've decided that the rhetoric of the Iranians reflects the reality of what's going on in Iran in terms of this nuclear weapon. Isn't that a leap of faith?
Well, we obviously have information in terms of what the Iranians are doing. We also have what the Iranians themselves have said. So we only are taking them at their word.
So you know for sure that they are working on a nuclear bomb?
I won't go that far, but clearly they have elements of their nuclear program that are in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. We want them to adhere to those resolutions, and we are willing to acknowledge the right of the Iranian government and the Iranian people to have a peaceful nuclear program if it's intended for the production of electric power and so on. And what is central then is trying to persuade the Iranians to agree to that and then to verification procedures under the IAEA that gives us confidence that it is indeed a peaceful nuclear program and not a weaponization program. The truth of the matter is, if Iran proceeds with a nuclear weapons program, it may well spark an arms race, a real arms race, and potentially a nuclear arms race in the entire region. So it's in the interests of all countries for Iran to agree to arrangements that allow it a peaceful nuclear program and give the international community confidence that that's all they're doing.
But the Obama administration seems to have a difficult circle to square, because on the one hand they're saying that they want improved relations with the Muslim world. On the other hand, any pressure on Iran is seen by people in the Muslim world, and again I put the emphasis on people, not necessarily the governments, that the US is not actually genuine in wanting to improve those relations, because they say Israel has nuclear weapons and the US is not doing anything about it.
The focus is on which country is in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. The pressure on Iran is simply to be a good member of the international community. It's the neighbors around Iran, our Arab friends and allies, are concerned about what is going on in Iran, and not just the governments. And so the question is, how does Iran become a member in good standing of the international community? That's in the interest of everybody.
Mr. Gates, thank you so very much. There were a lot of other topics that we would have liked to raise with you. We've run out of time. We're extremely grateful for the time that you've given us. Thank you.
Thank you.